Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
My name is Julia. I was an admission officer at Haverford College, an outside reader for Emory University, and I currently work at Milton Academy, an independent boarding and day school outside of Boston, Massachusetts.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy has a bachelor's degree from the University of Georgia and a master's degree from North Carolina State University. She works in private practice in Raleigh as a mental health therapist. And I'm so blessed to be able to work alongside both my beautiful daughters at School Match for You, a college counseling firm that I founded in 2010. Good afternoon, friends. I'm in a fantastic mood today. Had a client from South Florida visiting to check out Emory, and the family treated me to Japanese hibachi-style dinner last night and just had so much fun. And it's really nice when you're working with somebody on Zoom and you get to meet them in person. So I know the mom's a podcast listener. I'm not putting your name out there to protect your privacy, but I just wanted to publicly say thank you, and that was a blast. All right, friends, I've got 3 announcements today, and a couple of them are pretty important, and then we'll get into our content. The first one is that the webinar with Gil Villanueva, the VP of Enrollment at Rhodes College, and the webinar, or really a Q&A, it's really a Q&A session, not a webinar for both of them, with Andy Strickler are up. The sign-up sheets are up. So all you do is go to yourcollegeboundkid.com and look for the events tab. They've been up for about 4 days, but you didn't know unless I told you, right? Go to the events tab and you'll see 3 events there. You'll see our Durham gathering that we're having on March 23rd, Saturday. There's still spots remaining. We'd love to have you come meet our co-hosts, have some food, mingle, play some trivia. But particularly I'm referring to the Gil Villanueva question and answer session on all things admissions, March 3rd, and the Andy Strickler, Dean of Admission at Connecticut College, Q&A session about all things admissions, April 3rd, March 3rd, April 3rd. The times are up. The sign-up sheet is up. This is for college counselors. This is for students. This is for parents. We did this 3 or 4 years ago. We got a great response, and we're bringing this back, and if we get a good attendance, we'll add some more sessions. I actually have a commitment already from Colorado College. I'll be announcing that date pretty shortly to have a Q&A with you as well. It's just a great way for you to get answers to your questions about all things college admissions from 2 pros. So just go to yourcollegeboundkid.com, go to the events tab, and sign up and start thinking about your questions. There's actually a place right on the form where for you to ask your questions. And we'll pass those on, of course, to Gil and Andy, and we'll get through as many of them as we can in an hour. But I shouldn't call it a webinar. It's really just a Q&A session to pick the brain of admission experts. All right, my second announcement. So the biggest criticism of our podcast over the last 7 years is that some listeners don't like when we have a part 1 and a part 2, occasionally a part 3 or part 4. They just don't like that. They just wish we could run everything consecutively. The problem is it's impossible for us to do that with our system. In other words, we're not going to give up having an in the news section on Thursdays, admissions tip, admission vernacular, big number. We're not giving that up. We're not giving up question for a listener. We're not giving up college spotlights. We're not giving up interviews. And I know you guys don't want us to, because I hear from everybody all kinds of different things, like question for a listener, that's my favorite. College spotlights, that's my favorite. Interviews are my favorite. In the news are my favorite. So I know you guys like all them, and we're not giving those up. And we're not going more than 3 hours. Like, there's a reason why there's no other college podcast in the country, probably the world, that's giving you 3 hours of unique content a week. That doesn't mean we're the best podcast, because there's a lot of fantastic podcasts out there now. Way, way, way better than when we started this 7 years ago. But we do have the most content. And there's just no way we can do more than that. I know it's a 20-hour-a-week commitment from me, and it's a big commitment from the rest of our co-hosts and a team on the production side. And I'm also not giving up depth, because depth is just, for one, it's just part of who I am. I mean, my book on Amazon is 692 pages on college admissions. So maybe it's because I'm a chatterbox, or maybe it's because I like depth, or maybe it's a combination of both, but we're not giving up depth. So there's no way we can have depth and all those sections without dividing it up into part 1, part 2, part 3. And we can't take any more time from any more co-hosts. It's just not physically possible unless this was just our full-time job. And even if it was, quite honestly, 3 hours is enough content. Sometimes even our most dedicated listeners fall behind. You fall behind 3 weeks, and now you got 9 hours of content to listen to. And while we do have sporadic listeners, we love it when we can actually have listeners that just never miss an episode, because we're trying to fill in gaps in people's backgrounds and their knowledge. And if you get to everything, then you can really have a comprehensive understanding of college admission. So none of those things are options, but I've come up with a solution that I think is going to be workable for you and for us. Now, this is going to particularly pertain to our interviews. So from now on, instead of having to go part 1, part 2, part 3 for our interviews, we are going to put the entire interview up on yourcollegeboundkid.com in the interview tab. Now you say, Stuck, you've always done that. Yeah, but to be honest, sometimes we got them up late. There have been a few times it was more than a month after the interview happened before it went on the website. And I say that to my own chagrin. And that's actually on me. It's my job to kind of assemble, put it all together, then send it off to the production team and do the uploading. But what we're doing now, and this is what's different, and some of you might have noticed this, but for example, our last 3 or 4 interviews, right after part 1 was done, the whole thing was up on the website. And that's what we're going to do, which is the announcement. So let's get specific. So you're going to hear Andy Borst today, and it's a 2-part interview. And by Tuesday, the whole thing will be up. Gil Villanueva, you heard part 1 from him last week. If you heard Thursday's episode, Call Spotlight on Roads, the whole thing will be up by Tuesday, even before the Thursday goes live. And so we just think this is great on a number of levels. One, it avoids the part 1, part 2, part 3 for those who don't like that. Secondly, sometimes it's real time sensitive content and we'll get it to you sooner. And then thirdly, it's a way of breaking up Thursday, right? So you could kind of break Thursday up and make Thursday shorter. If you've already heard the interview, you could skip that on Thursday unless you just want to hear it again, which we also welcome all the time. Now, sometimes this will pertain to things other than our college spotlights because, our interviews, Freudian slip there, because sometimes college spotlights are interviews. So when our college spotlight is also an interview, yeah, that will be up sooner, and that leads me to my next announcement. I mentioned to you last week, this is the year of the interview. We're doing so many interviews, and it's not just me. Linda's got 7 to 10 on her docket. Lisa's got about the same. Vince is scheduling some. Obviously, Julia's been doing them with me, and Susan and I have plans to do some together. So all of us, our whole entire team is doing these interviews, and we're going to have way more interviews than we've ever had before. And I don't want them to run a year after we recorded them. So one of the things you're going to start to see is we are going to put some interviews in the news segment on Thursdays. That actually starts this week. It is news, but it's also an interview. So you expect to sometimes get multiple interviews in the same Thursday podcast. All right, we have a lot to cover today. Julie and I did part 1 last week of the Dartmouth decision, and today's the final part, and I'm warning you, I do not hold back telling you what I really think. So, just warning you, it gets real. And finally, a brand new interview. Andy Borst is back, the VP of Enrollment at the University of Georgia, UGA. But it's a whole new topic. We're looking at why are so many students going to Southern colleges in certain states these days. We'll discuss each of the reasons, and I'll see if Andy thinks this is a major factor or a minor factor. Today you'll hear part 1 of 2. All right, let's dive right in.
I would say while the majority of my students do take a test and still score very highly, it is not the majority that are reporting their scores to colleges.
I agree with you. We do not believe that most schools who say they're test optional are not test optional. But understand that doesn't mean that they don't like scores. It just means that they see the benefit. They feel that they can make decisions without them. And they know that there are people that enhance their student body that they wouldn't be there if they had to have test scores as a barrier to entry. And they feel they have enough information to ascertain whether that student can be academically successful. And so that's just important to know. I don't want people to think test optional means schools don't like good scores. And
Right.
If you know that, then I think you can help have the right balance there. That's a different category. That would be test blind, score free, test free. The reason why I often say test blind, score free, test free is because all three terms mean the same thing. A school will not see your scores. Even if you want them to see your scores, they will not be factored into the academic review rating. But what I find is that some people use the term test free, some use score free, some use test blind, and the people that use each term, they may not know what the other term is. So it's easy for me to just say all three so you know what I'm talking about. And you may be thinking, well, I hope you don't have to keep doing that. Well, not everybody hears every episode. And even if they do, they don't always remember. So I'll probably continue to do that at least for a while until when I'm in the counseling room, I understand. My students seem to understand that all three of those terms are used interchangeably, but it's still a relatively new concept. So I'll keep saying score free, test blind in some order. They won't see your scores. And so for them, it's a non-factor. Okay, let's move on to our next question. Why would Dartmouth return to test mandatory? So you have alluded to a lot of it, Julia, when you said they had their own research. And so I'll just mention a couple things. Here's a quote from Lee Coffin, who we've had on the podcast. There were many occasions since the school adopted its test optional policy in 2020 when he, meaning Lee, wished he had one more data point on a student to confirm what we think is a high achieving profile. Coffin said test scores would be especially useful as Dartmouth receives more applications from high schools that are unknown to the admission office and schools where grade inflation is a concern. Dartmouth's faculty also reviews anonymized data specifically for the college, issuing a report, and the school's president endorsed returning to testing. And so there's several articles I'm alluding to. One's Dartmouth reinstates SAT requirement in first for Ivy League. That's a Melissa Korn article from the Wall Street Journal. Then there's another article that came out that gets into some of the research. This is an opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal advocating testing. And here it says, Bruce, sorry, Bruce, if I butcher your name, Sacerdote, a Dartmouth economics professor involved in the school's testing review, said that under the test optional policy, low-income applicants withheld scores even when those results would have helped make their application stand out. Coffin said Dartmouth put scores in context for each applicant and to enroll diverse backgrounds, while the 1400 in the SAT might not wow admission officers if it's reported by a student attending a high-achieving high school. He said that the SCAME score would be notable from a student in a community where average scores were lower. And then Sacerdote, I'm mentioning his name different ways, Julia, so I don't know if I'm going to get it wrong a lot of the times, or maybe a blind squirrel finds a net every now and then. Maybe I'll get it the right pronunciation one of these times. So I'm going to go with Sacerdote. Do you know how he pronounces it?
No idea. Very sorry.
I went with Sacerdote. Now I'm going Sacerdote. Sacerdote said one of the most surprising findings for him was that an applicant's high school GPA might not be all that useful a predictor of college success. Students with a perfect 4.0 in high school earned college grades that were just zero point 0.1 higher than those with a high school GPA of 3.2. That's according to the Ivy Plus study that was done, which is just the Ivy schools and then 4 other schools like Chicago and Stanford and Duke. And, it's just a small little group of what's called the Ivy Plus. We've talked about them before. It explains a lot less than the SAT does alone, Sacerdoti said, of GPAs. And then there was another article that came out in the New York Times entitled Dartmouth Sees Value of the SAT. And this article, it goes on to talk about a little bit even more about their own research. So it says a commission from President, boy, there's some names that I'm struggling with here. Cyan Lee Belloc, Dartmouth faculty studied the role of standardized tests in admissions and produced a report finding to be an essential method by which admissions can identify applicants. And it goes on to basically say a lot of the same things that we said before, but it goes into a little bit more detail about who was involved in the report. This article here was another one that was in the Wall Street Journal. And then the one that was actually in the New York Times was called A Top College Reinstates the SAT. And this was an article by David Leonhardt. And here he gives a little bit more of the evidence. So he says, last summer, Cyan Belloc, a cognitive scientist who had previously run Barnard College in New York, became the president of Dartmouth. After arriving, she asked a few Dartmouth professors to do an internal study on standardized tests. Like many other colleges during the COVID pandemic, Dartmouth dropped its requirement. And then Belloc wanted to see the evidence. Our business is looking into data and research, understand the implications. And then it says 3 Dartmouth economists and a sociologist dug into the numbers. One of their main findings did not surprise them. Test scores were a better predictor than high school grades or student essays and teacher recommendations and how a student would do at Dartmouth. And so that's just a little bit of the evidence that they have that they've amounted. Any thoughts? I know you've already said that, hey, if a school has evidence that shows that, then the evidence is what it is, and it is what it is, and you kind of need to respect that. Any other comments on that, Julia?
Every college does this, right? Pandemic or not, they run numbers on everything. What predicted what? For our listeners who have already actually applied to college, and maybe are in college now, you might remember that after you were done with the cycle, even the schools that you weren't admitted to or you were admitted to but didn't decide to go to asked for some data points from you. And I remember my students are like, what? I don't get it. I applied test optional to this college. Why are they now asking me for my test scores? And it's for data so that they can make the best policies, so they can shape their best classes. I remember when I worked at Haverford. So Haverford is a very rigorous school, but I would say that there were certain metrics that we used to determine if a student would be successful in the sciences, particularly students who might be on the pre-med track. What we would see is students might be really committed to the idea of being pre-med. And so when they were met with some difficulty in a science course or a prerequisite, that's where we saw them struggle mightily. And then when they thought, oh no, I can't be a doctor now, they sort of fizzled out academically and or socially. So while when I worked at Haverford, it was still tests were required. And also on top of that, subject tests were. And so as one of the articles you just quoted, Mark, is that there are high schools that either might have a lot of grade inflation or are really underfunded and under-resourced. So a student with straight A's might be the best student that they have there, but it doesn't mean, to no fault of their own, that they're ready for a 4-year college that might be highly rigorous. And so we wouldn't, while we required the scores, we sort of had a threshold score for some of those students that I knew that if they could at least score a 500 on the Math 2 SAT subject test, that they would likely be okay. We could admit them ethically and know that they wouldn't struggle and they would likely make it through their major of choice or their area of choice. Of course, that's a moving target, right? That would change nowadays in terms of the numbers and what the research is. But so there's always been this kind of thought on this. But, Stanford, for example, ran the same numbers. So did Princeton. And they're not finding that they were missing students because of not requiring tests. So it is research particular to the college and their enrollment and their success. So There's lots of really important, smart people kind of running these numbers everywhere. So it really is contextual. The research applies just to that college and their applicant pool.
Yeah, and I'm going to say a few things where I'm going to be speaking for myself here, although I feel very confident that Susan and several of our other co-hosts would agree with me on what I'm about to say. This decision to me is disappointing by Dartmouth, and I'll tell you why. And you may look at it and say, why? They're showing that SATs are a better predictor than test scores, then why would it be disappointing? So for a few reasons. For one, I think you can improve your ability to read a file. If you're new to something, you can't expect you're going to be amazing at doing it right away. And I think just running the data, I believe the data will almost always show that test scores and GPA is a better predictor just of GPA. But there's a lot of other factors out there that are not being taken into consideration. First of all, let me say this. Test scores in and of themselves are not seen apart from context. They're seen in context, right? Like if someone took a test score once and all I saw was, it was in the 9th grade, that would be context that I would want to know, as opposed to somebody that took it later and I saw, they never even had algebra 2. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying that Dartmouth doesn't have put scores in context, because Lee even has come on here and talked about how they do that to a certain extent. But Bowdoin's been doing this for 53 years. Bates has been doing it for more than 40 years. Caltech has come out with research and shown that they're able to make decisions without scores. So why is it that those schools are able to do it? I don't believe that there's something so unique about the Dartmouth curriculum that means, personally, I don't. I'm just giving this is my own personal opinion. So what I believe is there's a lot of other factors to consider when you make this decision. Like one of the articles quoted from the University of California, and it showed how their own research indicated test scores aided in the predictability of GPA, and then they rejected their own research. And it actually did. Their own research did show it. So why would they reject it? Because there are a lot of other factors that have to be taken into consideration. One is, and I'm not, when I say this, I don't want to sound like, what's that term? I'm so soft, and I have to pander and pamper everybody. But the addition of test scores does add a significant amount of stress into students' life that we're already talking about some of our most stressed out generation with social media and all the pressures on these kids.
Right.
And things like that are things that a faculty study doesn't see. But when you're on the counseling side, we see all of that. Secondly, I believe you can do a lot of research on profiling GPAs and how they translate to GPAs in your context. And you can use tools like Landscape and the school profile and really delving deeply into a school to be able to put grades in context. It's not like you have no other tools to help you put grades in context. I agree grade inflation is a massive problem. I agree a 4.0 at one school is not a 4.0 at another school. I agree that there's some schools that have a 4.0, students have a 4.0, and they could come in and they could struggle. And I agree that if you had testing in that file, that could have helped you. But I also think there's other ways of getting that information that doesn't produce as deleterious an impact as it does on the high school students. Then you've got, do you want to fund a multi-billion-dollar testing agency where people are charging $1,000, supermaster test prep people out here, and the families that can afford to pay $1,000 can afford to pay for the supermaster testing guru? Do you want to fund that? Do you want to be a part of supporting that whole system? And then there's another fundamental thing I don't like, Julia, which is, like, at one point in the article, one of the articles actually said, like, it almost implied, like, why even look at GPA if it's such a poor predictor? So think about what message you're sending people. GPA is really correlated a lot to your work ethic and getting in there and grinding it out and working hard. Like, I think that's what we should be reinforcing. We should be reinforcing hard work, not just reinforcing being a good standardized tester. And so to me, you're putting an emphasis on something that I don't think as much emphasis should be put on. in terms of what that leads to, right? So what's wrong with, and then there's another thing. So let's say you say the research still is the research, Mark. You can't get away from it. What about some creative options like what Andy Strickler is looking at doing at Connecticut College, which is you submit your scores and we'll let you know whether or not they're an asset or not an asset in your file. That would completely take care of their whole concern that they're saying, what about low-income kids that had a 1400 that we would have admitted? Why don't you just set up a policy that says, send your scores in and we'll let you know whether, they'll enhance your application or not enhance your application. Why can't you go for something like that? Or even what I thought was a fair approach, which was test considered. So you're telling me when you say you're test considered that you're signaling to me that you really want test scores. Okay, but you know what you're still doing? You're still preserving the ability to identify that diamond in the rough kid that would be there and not there. Now, one of the reasons I feel passionate about this, I have two daughters. My oldest daughter is the better standardized tester, and my youngest daughter went her last 5 years of college without a B. She's a 4.0 student for her last 5 years of college, and she doesn't test as well as her older sister, and her older sister never had a 4.0 for one semester. So I see what drive and tenacity and organization and discipline and work and all those things which highly are correlated to college success can do. And so my concern is that kids that will get passed over when I think there are enough tools within an admissions officer's toolkit to be able to look at grades in context. And my argument would be, Dartmouth, have you really been doing this long enough to refine all of the skills at your disposal? And my argument to the faculty would be, faculty, are you just focusing in on GPA? Or do you see all of the ramifications it has for a kid in high school and what message it sends them? If grades don't matter that much, I'm going to be fair, Dartmouth's not saying grades don't matter. So they're saying grades and testing matters. But what message it sends them if they believe that you feel that how a student does over 4 hours is more important than all their work and sweat and equity over 4 years. Think about what message that sends to a kid. And think about the talented kids that are going to be discouraged and dissuaded from even applying to your school. Why can't you go for something more creative than just this? So I'm speaking for myself. I'm not speaking for Julia. But most people in the counseling community, I think that especially people that have been on both sides of the desk, they see the admission side, but they also see the impact on kids. And I just think that admission offices have the ability to refine their ability to read a file. I am not saying that they should treat every 4.0 as an amazing student. I'm all for digging under the hood and really learning, does this school have grade inflation? Read in school group. Look at that. Look at the track record of your school from different schools. Build out models like Georgia Tech has built out a model. And, I want to say this. I think Lee is one of the great people out here in college admissions. I really so appreciate his transparency. And I appreciate the fact that he even signaled and tipped his hand where they were going, unlike some other people that don't. Also know that a lot of other voices are weighing in on this, the president, the faculty, and a lot. Friends, when I was editing this podcast, I thought of so many other things I didn't say when Julie and I were talking that I should have said. So here's an addendum to my soliloquy that some might even call a diatribe, but I prefer to call it a soliloquy. Let me start by saying this. I'm very sympathetic to the frustration that having a test optional policy has to be. I mean, it's no fun getting asked, how do I know if my test score is high enough to submit? I know I would hate to be asked that question all the time, because it's very frustrating to say to the student, if you feel like it reflects your intelligence, submit your score. They feel like that was a nothing burger. What was that? It's also technically not accurate for any school that is taking socioeconomics, hardship, race, or the school context into consideration to just say, look to see if you're within our middle 50% of our profile. Or for a very well-resourced student in an overrepresented demographic, which, by the way, you may not even know any of that stuff when they ask you this, look to see if you are at or above the middle 50%. The correct answer has so much more nuance that you're in a no-win situation. You either tell the student that it's impossible for me to answer that without knowing the context of our applicant pool or your circumstances, and you leave them frustrated, or you give some general answer like, see if you're in the middle 50%, or see if you feel like it reflects your intelligence. But you know full well that if you say, see if you're in the 50%, that you make exceptions for certain under-resourced students from very hard-to-track demographics. So you leave saying, I hope I just didn't encourage a student to not submit their scores when they really should have submitted their scores. So you're in a no-win situation, and I fully understand why someone on the admission side, especially someone who hasn't spent significant time on the counseling side, could feel, I think we were just better off when we required test scores, and we didn't have this no-win situation. I'm also sympathetic to the view testing is part of life. You're going to get testing when it comes to law school. And Julie and I have an interview coming up, which we've already recorded, on understanding law school admissions. And when you hear that, you'll hear about the central role testing plays in the law school process. So I can see people saying, hey, can't get around testing all the rest of your life. I'm also sympathetic to the fact that test scores can sometimes tell you something. I'm not of the view that test scores are meaningless points of data. I once had a conversation with an admission officer, more than 30 years experience, but he was also a psychologist who had done a lot of research on the test. And he said to me, the test is a terrible test for the middle 80%, but it's actually a really good test for the extremes. The extreme on the high side and the extreme on the low side can actually tell you a lot. So I'm sympathetic to the person who says there is value gleaned from these tests, and to say they have no meaning whatsoever belies the truth. I'm not of the opinion that test scores are absolutely meaningless as a data point. So I'm sympathetic to that. I'm also sympathetic to schools like Dartmouth, who are looking at a bunch of straight A transcripts with an occasional C plus or B plus or B minus, usually in the 9th grade, or maybe first semester 10th, knowing full well some schools have so much grade inflation. And you've got to be thinking to yourself, boy, it would have been helpful to have some extra data points in the file. And I actually think that is one of the stronger arguments for testing, is when you get these transcripts from schools who you do not have a track record with, so you can't draw on any institutional research where you could have looked up how the grades from school X predict grades at your school, or you don't even have a regional rep that's even probably your territory manager even visited the school to get an on-site evaluation because maybe it's a new school, or you can't afford to visit very many schools within the time or the budget. So you don't get that aspect of the on-site assessment. And I also believe admission officers like Stu Schmill of MIT, Lee Coffin at Dartmouth, when they say testing can actually help us identify the really gifted kid who comes from a school with the average SATs like 850 and they have a 1400, a score that is outside our middle 50%, but it would have been impressive to me. Bruce Pock led Pomona's admission office for around 23 years. He's a good friend of Vince, our co-host. And he was at Vince's when Vince had me over to his place for breakfast in December 2022. And Bruce and I got into discussion, and Bruce made this same point. And Bruce is passionate about the advantages well-resourced students have. Anyone who knows him knows he was very outspoken about that in his time at Pomona, and the advantages well-resourced students have over moderately resourced and under-resourced students. So he also makes this point. So I do accept the genuineness of this argument. I'm also sympathetic to saying if scores predict grades better than grades predict grades, why would I not want to have test scores? I mean, that's asinine to me. Why would I give up something that statistically is predictive? Finally, I'm fully aware that schools don't all have to be a monolith. We can have different schools with different missions and different ways of evaluating applications. Now, you knew this was coming. You knew the but was coming. And here it comes. Having said all that, let me share a few reasons why the Dartmouth decision is disappointing to me. The argument, if test scores predict grades better than grades, so why not use them, is short-sighted and limited for a few reasons. You know what most likely predicts grades better than test scores? Do your parents both have master's degrees or doctorate degrees? Does your family make over $250,000? And does the student that we are talking about attend a college prep independent school? That predicts grades better than test scores. So stick with me on this one. Assume I'm right. Would you really want a school to just intentionally prioritize kids in admissions whose parents have master's or doctorate degrees, family income over $250,000, and the kids attend a college prep independent school? Of course not. But why? You would say that's discriminatory. Or you might say that will lead to more homogeneous learning environment, an echo chamber, and it wouldn't expose kids to all the different people that are out there that they're going to meet in life. They wouldn't be exposed to different kids' experiences, thought processes, worldviews, and culture. So just because something predicts grades better doesn't mean you have to have it as part of your criteria. Secondly, one of the biggest problems I have with the studies of faculty is they fail to understand that admissions is actually like a coin, and a coin has two sides. But they're only looking at the one side, what criteria produces the highest GPA or correlates best with GPA. They're missing a very important side of that coin. And the impact of such a policy has on students and parents. So let me give you an example. Suppose I were to say, what car is better? An S-Class Mercedes-Benz or a Hyundai Sonata? Sorry for all you Hyundai Sonata drivers out there. Hope you're not offended. Well, let's see what the faculty have to say. That would be tantamount to saying whatever car has the best longevity, whatever car has the smoothest ride, whatever car has the most upgrades is the best. Well, of course the S-Class Mercedes-Benz is better than the Sonata. So there's your answer. Buy an S-Class Benz. But let's take the other side of the coin into equation. The Sonata's $25,000 to $35,000 new, depending on the perks and, additions you have on the car, all the bells and whistles. The S-Class base price, $115K, and with add-ons, it could go up to $135K. So is the S-Class really better for a family making $80,000? No, because you took the other side of the coin or the other side of the equation into consideration. And that's what doesn't happen with all these faculty studies. They're just in their own echo chamber, and they're not really realizing the impact it has on students and the impact it has on parents and the consequences this big emphasis on testing has. And those consequences, in my opinion, are severe and severely negative. Now, I'm not necessarily an advocate of test blind. I think test optional is great. It gives you the opportunity to use it if you want to use it. Share it if you want to share it. You could even go test considered, like Dartmouth had done. Now, just this week, a mom said to me, I guess I'm going to have to start test prep in the 7th grade for my youngest son now. Is that the culture Dartmouth wants to perpetuate? People feeling they need to start test prep in the 7th grade? Schools designing all their curriculum around testing rather than critical thinking and real learning? Is that the behavior that you want to reinforce? I bet the faculty made this decision. They weren't thinking about that. Impact on students, impact on parents, impact on school curriculum, because they don't live in that world. It isn't that they're callous. It isn't that they're malicious. They're just out of touch with the consequences of their decision for students and parents, in my opinion. Before I interviewed Lisa Prescott, who has been at UCSB for 38 years, the director for most of that time, we were having a conversation about test scores, and she said, Mark, I don't think our readers can handle seeing test scores and not have it create so much bias in our reader ratings that they won't be able to see other things like character and have the character count to the extent that we should. So if somebody with almost 40 years of experience doesn't feel test scores can be put into context, I think it applies to a lot of other people as well. And it was my experience in admissions as well. You've heard me say this a number of times. Numbers do voodoo on the brain. Now, one argument that was given was when we see the scores of some test optional applicants after the admission process is over, we realize their score would have been the extra data point. They could have helped them, tipped them in. Well, my answer to that is be more explicit up front and give kids guidance. You can do what Andy Strickler's doing at Connecticut College, where he tells his counselors, I tell every one of our counselors, we read to admit, we don't read to deny. Share your scores and we'll personally advise you whether your scores should be submitted or not submitted. You could go to that system and that completely takes care of that problem and it removes all the guesswork. Perhaps you don't like that. Well, if your research shows that kids need a 1400 on an SAT to do well, if you have the research to show that, or a 700 math, then why don't you come out and share that? Why does that have to be clandestine? And you have to keep that secretly in your mind, and they have to guess that. Now, I understand that it's not as simple as that, right? People are afraid of lawsuits and being accused of discrimination. It's a lot easier to keep your secret sauce secret. But there are other schools that do that. There are many schools that tell people explicitly, if this is your score, submit it. If this is not your score, submit it. And you can also tell people, listen, this is a track record. When we see scores in this range, we have a track record of success. And when we have scores below that, we don't have a track record of success. Most admission officers I talk to about this at highly selective schools say they're able to look at the rigor of the curriculum and the grades in that rigor and basically get what they would get from test scores. They can be successful. And if we're going to give up test scores, then we're not going to give up the other stuff. So you can do that. So if you have a physics major with no SAT or ACT, you can simply say, and it's a highly selective school, let's see if they got to BC Calc. Let's see if they got to Physics C. Let's see if they got a good grade in there. Students that are getting good grades in BC Calc and Physics C are likely going to be successful at your school. Well, let's say stuck. What about grade inflation? You didn't account for grade inflation. Guess what? I have no problem with a school saying if there's no SAT or ACT, I want to see a good AP score if a student has taken APs before the 12th grade in 10th and 11th. But Stuck, I thought you were for test optional. Why are AP scores different? I do see AP test scores as different for a number of reasons, because I don't see families in 7th, 8th, and 9th grade obsessing about prepping for AP exams. I don't see schools redesigning their whole curriculum for that. They don't even know what APs are going to take at that time and that age. So I don't see it being as disruptive and deleterious to a student or a parent or a school's health. Now, Dartmouth didn't even give test recommended one full year. They announced it a few months ago. They didn't give it one full year to do research on it to see how well it works. I think they really needed to try that policy out. Personally, I thought that was honesty and some transparency. When you're applying to Dartmouth, scores are going to be somewhat of a factor because it's recommended, but it still gave them the flexibility. But to not even test it out for 1 year to see if it worked before you change it, I think that's questionable. I also think they need to think about how all of this change impacts students and parents. So start of 2020, Dartmouth's test mandatory. Then they go to test optional because of the pandemic, totally understandable. In late 2020, and they stay with test optional in 2020, 2021, 2022. Then in 2023, they go to test recommended. And in a recent article that appeared in Inside Higher Ed this week, where Lee Coffin is interviewed, it's an excellent interview. And Lee makes a great case for the decision and why they went to their decision. But he says in the article, he described their previous position as a test pause. And it was never meant to imply that they didn't like test scores. Well, I've heard Dartmouth describe their decision many, many times. I don't miss that episode of that podcast. And also, we had 2 hours with Lee on our podcast to drill him on these questions. And There were many times he did not describe that policy as a test pause. So I just think you need to think, if you're going to be all over the place in how you describe it, is that really fair to students, parents, and counselors? Why not stick with test considered for a while? Do the research on that. Why not meet with the other people that feel like they're able to admit students without scores and see what you can learn from them, rather than put everybody on a roller coaster all over the place on this? Once again, I'm not speaking for any of our other co-hosts. I'm speaking for myself, but I'm trying to keep it real with our listeners and tell you exactly what I would say if Lee and I were to have another conversation on this topic. And also, why can all of their competitors feel like they can make a decision without scores and Dartmouth can't? You know? I mean, look at all the schools that have made this decision without scores. And are they the only ones? Just to name a few: Princeton, Stanford, Harvard, U Chicago, Duke, Amherst, Pomona, the UCs, Vanderbilt, and so many others are rejecting test mandatory admissions, and they are saying they feel that they can find an applicant and evaluate a file without the scores. So why is it that Dartmouth can't do it and the others can? Also, do you really, really want to support families that can pay $500 to $1,000 an hour to hire some test prep guru and start prepping their kid in 9th grade so they can take the kid's 29 ACT and get up to a 34? Is that really the behavior you want to reinforce? Once again, I repeat Andy Strickler saying, I train our counselors to read to admit. I can tell you, if you're sending the message to students that your test score is a better predictor for us than your 4-year academic record, they are not going to feel like you are reading in order to admit. I cannot imagine a more deflating message to students. All your hard work for 4 years counts less at this school because we've determined that how you do on a 2-hour test trumps everything you've done for 4 years. That's going to feel to a student like you're reading to deny, not like you're reading to admit. And I can't imagine a more deflating message. You can't just ask a faculty to do a study on what predicts GPA the best. You have to ask, how does my testing policy impact 7th graders, 8th graders, 9th graders, 10th graders, 11th graders, and 12th graders, parents, and school culture? And what role does socioeconomics play in your decision-making policy? Julie, I'm going to turn it over to you for any final remarks. But my final thought on that is, I do believe that there are better alternatives, and I'm not asking a school to compromise on their ability to take in kids. You know what? I will say this, Julia. There's a student that I'm aware of that got into a school test optional and has 2 Fs now in a really competitive program. And things like that set back the test optional movement, because then a faculty member goes back and says, what are you doing admitting this kid who can't do the program? Were their test scores? And if schools get one too many of those type of stories, then they're like, you know what, we better return to testing. So I'm not naive about some of the internal pushback that happens. And I certainly don't want to say there's no value to testing, but I would say value at what cost? To me, the cost is too high. And to me, an admission office has enough tools in their toolkit to be able to admit kids without scores and make good decisions. But throw it to you for the final word.
I think what I hope we accomplish, Mark, and what I've been trying to do with students is these 2 pieces about the overall look at the role of standardized testing, and then looking at it in particular to Dartmouth. What I hope this does is sort of lower that anxiety people are having, just simply because in Ivy League school, one went that way, it is not an overall statement on selective college admissions and the use of standardized testing. So I very much hope that people realize that this is not necessarily a trend to be worried about or thinking about, that because a very selective school did that means that other people will follow suit. And I really just I'm trying to give the benefit of the doubt here, in that I really hope people can focus on the main driver of Dartmouth's decision is because there might have been really, not that they weren't admissible, but there were markers missing that the student could or could not be successful at Dartmouth. And that's more what they're looking for. They're not necessarily now requiring tests so they can really hold everyone to that standard. It's more in the spirit of trying to enroll a more diverse class that would, where they're missing markers of success for those students. And because a student thought maybe their test score was below the average, therefore it would be bad, that actually could have helped them get admitted. So I like to focus on the spirit of that. I think that is really what they're trying to do here.
And I know Stu Schmill has said the same thing at MIT.
Exactly.
He said the same thing. He feels like test scores can help them identify an extraordinary student that could be able to do well. And I definitely think that that is the motive and the intention. I have no question that it stems from good motives. I think it's important to mention that. But the one thing I want to say, Julia, is that, you know what I found, and I'm sure you're the same way, so many people never really believed these schools were test optional anyway.
Yes, it really sticks with me. My partner sort of gives me great reality checks a lot of the time, just for our listeners, just a reminder. So he didn't go to the greatest school system, education. He doesn't. No one in his family, except maybe one person, has gone to a 4-year college, and so he's grown up just like other folks. Like, this is not for me. This is meant to be rigged against me, and so something like this, even that's not the intention of the policy, the impact is it can often be like, here's another thing that's just keeping me out. Here's another thing. Of course they don't want, I know they don't want me to begin with. So of course they don't want my lower test score. So I think you're right. I think as much as that's not the intention, we have to be really mindful of managing both intention and impact.
Yeah. And I think that for people who felt like, I knew they weren't test optional now, and here's the proof. Knew it wasn't test optional now.
Yep.
Look at the quote from Yale. Look at the quote from the Brown president. I really think if you just come back to what I said, it's always better to submit high test scores. That's always better, even for test optional schools. The second best option is always to be test optional if they don't allow it if your scores are weak. Weak is going to be completely in the context of one school. Weak in one school could be amazing in another school. So that's the tricky part, finding out, are my scores weak or strong for a particular school? We can't solve that in this conversation. And then the worst thing to do is to submit low scores to a test optional school. That was true before, and it's true now. So really nothing has changed. It really hasn't. Like, one school has come forward and said, okay, you are returning to test mandatory admissions. That doesn't change at all what you should do as an applicant. Applicant. Submit your higher scores if you have them. Don't submit your lower scores if they're low. And that's your best option. So this whole thing is really a nothing burger. Now, the hard part is discerning on a school by school basis whether they're low. And you're going to really, really need to get some guidance on that, because even for us, Julia, that do this all the time, when you say that we are constantly trying to discern on a school by school basis, especially when people are taking context into consideration, what's a good school, what's not a good school, like, it's tricky for us, and we're professionals and this is our job.
Agreed.
Awesome. Well, hopefully this was helpful, listeners. You asked for it. We tried to deliver.
Thank you.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, we're blessed to have Andy back for a second interview. I realize it's back-to-back Andys, Andy Strickler and Andy Borst. And in this interview, we'll be looking at why students head out of state, and specifically, why do they go to Southern schools? And in part one, Andy shares data on the 5 states where students are leaving the most, and he shares where they're going. Andy shares some of the reasons that determine which colleges that are experiencing a surge of applications. Andy mentions the states where UGA is experiencing the greatest amount of out-of-state applications. And I ask Andy about a number of reasons I think may have contributed to the growth of applications, both at UGA and to the South in general, and Andy tells me whether he thinks the things I list are major factors, minor factors, or non-factors. And finally, Andy explains why he moved from being the VP of enrollment at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, to the University of Georgia in Athens. Listen and enjoy. All right, yeah, you're ready to transition to a whole new topic?
All right, let's do it.
All right, so this is a topic that I asked Andy if we could talk about. It's of interest to me, and partly because I moved from Pennsylvania down here to the Atlanta area 15 years ago, north to the south. He made that trek from Illinois down to Georgia as well, and there's been a lot written. I don't know if you saw that Town and Country article that came out a while ago. Did you catch that by any chance, Andy?
I did not. What can you tell me about it?
Oh, it talked about the massive flock to the southeast, and that's happening, and people are abandoning places like Boston for the southeast, and it had some good data on it. We did a whole episode on that. But you see a lot of data. Talk about what you're seeing in terms of trends when it comes to people migrating to southern locations for college.
Right. So I think it comes down to student choice set. And when we look at data for the states that are exporting the most students, exporting meaning that they're graduating from a high school and a student and leaving that state to go to a college in a different state. So the states that are sending the most students out are California, because it's huge, Texas, because it's also huge, New Jersey, New York, and Illinois. So those are the big five. So you've got 1 red state, 4 blue states, but we're not seeing as much data about flowing based off political patterns. Mostly what we see is students who are leaving those 5 states, and it's not only those 5 states, and attending schools that are within at least close proximity. So if you're leaving Illinois, students are most likely to go to Iowa or Indiana. If they are leaving California, they're most likely to go to Oregon and Arizona. Texas, the University of Arkansas has increased their number of students from Texas by 1,000 in about a 5-year time period. So they're still staying somewhat local. And where I see the difference in choice sets happening is that students aren't necessarily comparing flagship to flagship or a flagship to a land grant institution. Although there is some of that. There's always the anecdote of this other school gave me $10,000, so I'm not going to go to this school. I heard it all the time when I was at Illinois, is that, well, I could go to my state flagship, but the University of Alabama is going to give me this great scholarship based off of my test scores. I hated hearing that. Heard it all the time. But when we looked at who those students were, the choice set is not necessarily from flagship to flagship. It is often between the regional public institution or small private institution or another flagship. So a student isn't necessarily choosing between the University of Illinois and the University of Iowa or Indiana University. Oftentimes, they are choosing between a non-flagship, so Illinois State, Western Illinois, Northern Illinois, and Iowa, Iowa State, Indiana. We see the same thing in students that are leaving California aren't picking Arizona State over Berkeley. They're picking Arizona State over another, probably California State school. And I think price point has a lot to do with it. It's very difficult to speculate as to the why, but we see the haves and the have-nots continuing to separate. The institutions that have the greater amount of resources are certainly not hurting for students. They're not hurting for applications. In fact, they're having to start to decide how big they want to be as an institution. And then we see regional institutions starting to really struggle to be where they've been at in the past. And as much as state resources are flowing either to scholarship funds or directly to allocations to students or to small private schools that are highly tuition dependent, that discount rate is really creeping up. We're now over that 50% mark for many small private institutions, which it's a great time to be a student. If you're in high demand, there are lots of places that are trying to get your attention to enroll at your institution. It is a buyer's market where students can decide what institution they want to go to. And that's where the choice set comes into play. Do I want to go to this flagship institution and pay a higher rate because I perceive it to have a better quality or more resources? Or do I want to go to this other institution that's going to give me lower debt, potentially a similar return on my investment when it comes to the career outcome that I choose, but is such at a lower price point because they're offering me a heavy, I won't even call it scholarship, a heavy discount to attend there.
So I want to follow up with something you said, because it's something I've been thinking about a lot. We hear all the talk about how hard it is to get into college these days, and we know that's coming from a subset of the population that's the minority of institutions, right? Regional publics, a lot of them are struggling. Certainly community colleges have been struggling. And in some cases, some flagships even, especially if their states are experiencing a lot of out-migration. I mean, West Virginia comes to mind. Their financial woes have been well written about. But there's been this increase in applications to flagships and selective privates.
Mm-hmm.
What is your theory on why everyone's clustering to, what would you say, 75 schools? I don't know what the number is, but it feels like it's under 100.
Yeah, I would say that we're probably defined by U.S. News and World Report's top 100 rankings. As much as I hate rankings, I cannot deny the impact that they have on students' perceptions of quality and on enrollment choices. Of those top 100 ranked institutions by U.S. News and World Reports, many of them are still admitting over 90% of their students. Like, admit rates are not a great indicator of how good an institution is. There are also institutions outside of that top 100 that are great places. It's the difference of, are you a great institution? Do you do amazing things with the students you serve? Or do you just filter out to serve students that would be able to succeed no matter where they choose to attend? Common App has made it easier for students to apply to 19, 20 institutions, when in the past it may have only been one or two or three. And so admissions offices are facing pressure about, well, we want to see applications continue to go up and up and up and up. Well, they're probably admitting very similar populations of students as they have in the past. It's just that the application volume has increased. And then that has made it harder for institutions to judge what their yield rate, so the number of students that they've offered admission to, how many of them will choose to enroll. And then that's where the price discounting comes into play.
I mean, U.S. News has been around since 83, so it's 40 plus years, right? We've been talking about them. It's my 25th year doing this. We've been talking about them forever. I'm trying to figure out what is it, especially more recent. Like, a lot of schools experienced somewhere around a 30% surge, at the start of the pandemic, and those numbers have sort of held steady. I'll tell you what one of my theories is, and I'll see what your thoughts are, that it's kind of, you alluded to it, like, so much of the growth is coming from students applying now to 20 schools instead of 6.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of the students that are doing that are students that are aspiring in the more competitive schools. And the more they hear that it's harder to get in, they be, well, my solution to that is, I'm not doing 12 apps. Let's throw another 8 apps in there. And so but that's a particular subset of the population. I think it really skews heavily toward, highly educated families, usually coming from wealthier zip codes, public or private, very aspirational, and attending an elite school is just really very prized within the value system. And so that's the group that's adding more and more apps. And so they're very aspirational toward that group of schools. How does that land? Do you think there's substance to that, or would you push back?
I do think that there's substance to that. I think that there's another population of students that don't know what the financial realities of college will be, who will qualify for free and reduced lunch, that are applying through fee waivers, and are also casting a wide net to see who's going to give them an affordable education. So you kind of have the two groups, the really affluent group that can afford to apply to 20 different schools, and the students that have financial need, who it's not costing them additional dollars to be able to apply. But then you have this group in the middle that can't afford to apply to 20 different places. So I think you're absolutely right, is that there's that population that is only applying to the most selective institutions, that are chasing the sticker on their car. And then you have the other group that is applying to a lot of places, looking for the best financial fit, not necessarily the best institutional fit.
So let's come back to this move to the South. I don't know if you know Fabrizio. You probably do, at University of Tennessee, but he's shared data that they've gone from 17,000 to 51,000 apps in 10 years. Those of us who do this, we see it. We see big application growth at the Clemsons, at the at the Auburns, the Alabamas. Certainly University of Georgia absolutely is in that category. And it wasn't very long ago that, I've heard UGA say this over and over again. They would say, you know, we don't look at alumni status. We don't look at gender. We don't look at race. And the rhetoric used to be, we don't look at in-state, out-of-state, and we rarely look at major, only in certain unique instances. Well, now, you've had to enact an 80-20 sort of policy, 80% in-state, 20 out-of-state, largely because of the surge in out-of-state applications. So, like for Georgia, for example, where are you seeing the most increased applicant growth? Like what states compared to if you were to look back 5 to 10 years ago and look now?
Sure. And it's fun going from one flagship to another flagship that's in a very similar market position outside of a major metropolitan area in a more rural college town community. Very similar rankings, very similar, like all of the things are so similar. Just one's in the Midwest and one's in the South. What I have found is interesting, the application behavior is the growth in applications from out-of-state students. So University of Georgia will have roughly about 50,000 applications. 60% of those will come from out of state. But it's the legislative expectation that we are 80%, 20%. It's not codified, but that's kind of like, we would like to see that. That means that we're still admitting half of the Georgia students that apply, but we're only admitting a quarter of the out-of-state students that apply. And when we see spikes in enrollment behavior, it's not necessarily because we win national championships. It has to do with students who are choosing to leave Pennsylvania or New Jersey and coming to southern locations. Not as much of students who are leaving California or Texas. And so there are more students growth, there's more exposure, there's more emphasis on rankings, all of the things that are pushing students to apply to the same places over and over and over again. But that's where I mentioned the separation between the haves and the have-nots. If you're lucky enough to be in one of those positions, I work with individuals who aren't at an institution like mine, who are way better at their job than I am. But it's just the market position of their institutions and trying to serve what's the institutional mission. The University of Georgia is the flagship and land-grant institution for the state of Georgia. That's why the emphasis is on first enrolling Georgia residents and then augmenting with really great out-of-state students that are going to improve the education for everybody.
So where you mentioned Pennsylvania and New Jersey as two places you've seen increased state growth. Can you mention sort of other states where you've seen a surge in growth in the last 5 to 10 years besides Pennsylvania and Jersey to UGA?
New York, Tennessee, Texas, modest increase, but it's still somewhat eastern half of the United States. Now, Kendall Jenner was just in Athens, and there was 25 million people that saw the national championship game in 2023, and 250 million followers on Instagram for one person who saw them enjoying the Athens community. So that exposure that hits a large number of people is always interesting to see how that will affect future application behavior.
It was really recent, Andy. I remember UGA was 87% Georgia, 13 out of state. Like I'm talking about probably 3 years ago. It was really recent. And so to go from 87-13 to, whoa, we better put a cap on this 80-20 because of what you said, we're seeing more out-of-state applicants. Like you just said, Andy, 60% of the applications to UGA come from out of state. So I'd love to just explore the reasons why you feel that's happening, for UGA. Why are you getting more out of state applicants in your opinion?
So I want to point out the difference between percentages and numbers. So if you were to look at 10 years ago, you would see that the University of Georgia was 85% Georgian. And then now, the most recent available data, you would see that we're 75% Georgian. Last year, we were at 82%, so it fluctuates a little bit. But you hear 85 to 75%, and you're like, wow, why are you focusing so much on out of state? And the answer is we're not. We've actually increased the number of Georgians that are in the freshman class by 1,100 in that same time frame. So yes,
you guys expanded your class size. You guys expanded your class size too.
It's a bigger class size. If more students want to go here, we're going to try and grow capacity to be able to accommodate that size. Now we're starting to hit the upper edges of where we can accommodate the number of students coming in housing, in dining, in parking, at football games. So we have to be intentional. We have to manage the enrollment so that we can grow within the capacity of what our campus can continue to offer a really great undergraduate experience.
So I want to go through some potential reasons that I think could be contributing to the growth, and just get your opinion on whether you what role you think they play. One is UGA hasn't been on the Common App that long. So going on the Common App, is this year 3, I think, for the Common App?
Yes, year 3.
Yeah. So what role do you think that's played in leading to more out-of-state apps?
I think it's a huge role. And you can see the application kind of moderately trending, and then you can pinpoint that 3 years ago when we joined the Common App, and then you see this 30% spike in applications in total, but most of them are coming from out-of-state students.
What about, I'm just going to call it football, frats, and fun? I mean, it's not a mistake on a lot of people that back-to-back national championships, almost 30 straight wins in the SEC. People have often said, a multi-million-dollar marketing budget couldn't pay for that kind of TV exposure and publicity. And I know as someone who works with students, there are a lot of people that they look at that and they think, you know what, I'm going to get education, but I want to have fun. And that looks like fun to me.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we don't necessarily need to win national championships. I would love to win more national championships. But now the prerequisite to enrollment is that students see on TV other undergraduate students having a really great time cheering for their team who's winning on the field. And then they come and visit and they see a great college town that has several different places to eat at and beautiful weather. Why wouldn't you want to go there? And they offer a really great education. Those things add up pretty quick to seeing increased demand.
So I'm going to try to decouple a couple of things. So yeah, one was the whole football fun thing, right? But that also applies to Michigan get some buzz from that. Wisconsin get some buzz from that. Some other places get some buzz. You also mentioned weather. So what role do you think weather plays at all in increased surge in demand?
I really want to dig into this. I don't have a data-informed perspective. I just have my personal selfish. It was 70 degrees in January here in Georgia and how beautiful it was. So I'm used to those cold Illinois winters where everyone's kind of hunkered down, running in between buildings. And then here, everyone's just kind of out strolling, enjoying the beautiful weather, walking in between classes. So I can't give you an informed perspective that really says, oh, if you are in this tempered climate, this is the impact on your enrollment. But selfishly, it's pretty great.
Well, it's a big reason I moved here. And I was having a conversation with my neighbor who moved here about a year and a half ago from Ohio. Okay. He's always outside with his shirt off, no matter what time it is. And I was talking to him once and he said, especially when he first got here, he's like, is it always like this here in January? And then he said, I should have moved here 10 years ago. And I can tell you, I have a lot of students that will either talk about seasonal affect disorder or just will say like warmer weather is important to me. So if you don't mind me asking, Andy, what were some of the reasons that made you decide to take the position here and, at the UGA?
I think that this is one of the best enrollment management positions in the country. I get to work with David Graves in undergraduate admissions, Nancy Ferguson in the Office of Student Financial Aid. So I have national experts in their field being able to lead complicated offices that are managing competing resources. I'm at a great institution that has realistic expectations for its future, that has strong leadership, that wanted to create an enrollment management perspective that made sense to me. That's why I was willing to move my family to Georgia and to check this out. And so far, it's been fantastic.
And that's a good promo. I don't even know if you know this, Andy, but David Graves has committed to come on the podcast. Great. I'm interviewing him in April. So I started talking with you about your interview in September of 22. I started talking with him in June of 2022, but that's been on me, not him. I finally got back to him and he said, let's do it in April. So that's one reason why I'm going to keep most of the UGA admission questions for him. But yeah, he's one of the great pros and has a fantastic blog of his own. You mentioned Rick's got a different kind of blog, right? Which is great at Georgia Tech, but Dave's just got real great transparency. If you want to know how Georgia makes decisions, check out the UGA admissions blog, and I look forward to having Dave here for that. So
that's great.
Let's talk about some other things that sometimes come up. What about cost? What about cost? Like some Southern, and you could, you don't have to comment only on UGA. You could also talk about other Southern schools, cost of living being lower, potential for merit scholarships that some places don't have, especially if you're looking at private Northeastern selective need-based only schools. I mean, you could be looking at a $90,000 sticker. I mean, I have a really strong student at UGA from out of state now that's paying under 30 because of the merit scholarships that they were able to get. Any thoughts on that?
So going from Illinois that has a high cost, high aid model where the sticker price is higher and they have a large amount, they have a $110 million budget in need-based financial aid, in institutional aid that is almost all committed to need. So it is going to the students that need it the most.
And Illinois mostly too. Right?
So that's Illinois. That's Illinois.
Yeah.
Georgia does a much better job of managing their lottery and directing those funds to the education needs. So the Hope and Zell scholarship, covering about $10,000 per student towards tuition, really reduces the cost for the majority of the students that are here. The institutional aid budget is pretty small, and our fundraising efforts are mostly directed towards need. But there's a really great merit scholarship coming from the state that's a student can go to Tech or to UGA or to Kennesaw or to many other great institutions in the state. And that's why I think it's really hard for out-of-state students to pull students out of Georgia.
Yeah, I once had a selective Northeastern school when I was on the school side, on the school placement side, say it's tough getting students from Georgia and Florida too, because of Bright Futures and Florida Prepay, right?
Right.
And so this admission officer said, it's tough for us getting kids from Georgia and Florida because you guys have Hope Scholarship, Bright Futures, Florida Prepay, and they have to be willing to pay a lot more, and not everybody's going to be willing to do that. Friends, this concludes the first part of my interview with Andy Borst, examining the reasons why students head out of state, especially why they're heading south. Hope you'll join us next week for the final part. On Thursday's episode, the director of admissions from Colorado College is back, and we're discussing every question you could ever imagine a student or a parent could have about a gap year or a gap semester. Matt Bonser is a national expert on this topic of gap years, and Colorado College is known as a leader at a pro-gap year school. So we'll be doing a real deep dive with Matt over the next 2 Thursdays, where he'll answer all my questions on the gap year. For a question from a listener, Jane from Connecticut has a son who's a talented classical pianist, and she wants to know what's the best way to showcase his accomplishments in his application. And Susan will join me to answer Jane's question. We have another brand new interview. Have you ever wanted to become a college counselor? Have you ever wanted to help an under-resourced student find the right college for them? Well, Scholar Match wants to invite our listeners to go through a training program and get matched with a student so that you can help them find the right college, get a great financial aid package, and just answer their questions about college. If you love college admissions, you love service, you want to help out a student, this is an interview you are going to love, and it'll be a 3-parter. And for our spotlight, you'll hear the final part of Gil Villanueva, the VP of Enrollment at Rhodes College, and me, and we're discussing Rhodes College. This is the first time we've ever had 3 interviews on one episode, but that's what you're going to get. Friends, remember, your attitude, not your aptitude, will determine your altitude. See you on Thursday, friends. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us, and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Linda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joyce Ducker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stelianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Linda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcast. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.